It is the number one concern. If you want to do something that's just going to completely destroy the foundation of the United States of America, you bring in a central bank digital currency and it's just completely over. It's just the absolute most frightening thing for freedom and wealth creation. There is this change coming, and with the elite wanting to come out on top, in many ways, it's not so much that they're trying to intentionally keep you down. It's not that we have these people sitting around the table like Dr. Evil going, how do we, corner the markets? But they are trying to preserve their power and their wealth. And if yours has to go away in order for that to happen, then that's just okay by them. You have to own things. They want you to own nothing. I want you to own everything.
On the Spot with Michelle McCory is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin.
Hello, I'm Michelle McCory. Thank you for joining us. A major move for the accelerated adoption of CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. The global bank messaging network, SWIFT, is planning a new platform to connect all the central bank digital currencies now in development to the existing financial system. This platform is expected to launch within the next 2 years and would be one of the most significant developments for the nascent CBDC ecosystem, given SWIFT's key role in global banking. Currently, around 90% of the world's central banks are exploring CBDCs, which are programmable digital currencies that operate as fiat currency and are controlled and issued by central banks. They can be used to monitor every single transaction, obliterating privacy and anonymity, and can be programmed to work or not work, depending on the nature of that transaction. And CBDCs, according to my next guest, are a critical part of the agenda for a new financial world order. She warns that there is a great reset ahead, that we are on the precipice of a financial world war where fortunes will change and financial stakes will shift. She cautions that the global elite are jockeying to come out on top in this new order, and that in the process will leave us owning nothing and having less freedom and control over our lives. Carol Roth is a New York Times best-selling author. Her most recent book is You Will Own Nothing. Her other bestsellers include The Entrepreneur Equation and The War on Small Business. She's also a self-proclaimed recovering investment banker and an advocate for economic freedom and wealth creation. Carol, thank you for joining us. Great to have you here on Kitco.
So nice to be with you, Michelle.
So, Carol, I really enjoyed the book. As I mentioned, I love the way that it brings together various phenomena, explains the links, connect the dots, if you will. And I'll get into CBDCs, which I mentioned at the top, and digital IDs and social credit scores and how this all ties in together, and the role of big tech and the World Economic Forum. So we have a lot to unpack here, but let's start off with an overview of the coming World War F, as you call it, that you're saying is imminent.
So this all sounds very conspiratorial, doesn't it? That there's going to be a new world order, and that sounds very scary. And only the people who are crazy would say that. But if you go to the White House's website and you look at remarks that President Biden gave to the Business Roundtable, which is a group of the major business leaders here in the United States, many publicly traded companies and the like. If you go back to, I think it was March of 21, he talks about the fact that on a regular basis, things change in the financial order, and says there is going to be a new world order out there, and we have got to lead that. And I'm sure the we he was talking about it was the people in the room and him, and not necessarily me or anybody who's listening here. But this is the reality that we're in. We, particularly in the United States, have been very, very blessed to live through this incredible period in history where the US has been at the center of the global financial system. We're the holder of the world reserve currency, and we're about 80 years into that cycle. But before us, it was the British, and before the British, it was the Dutch. And so I would imagine at those point in times when you're in that pole position, you feel very invincible about it. And you can't imagine that there might be another time when things are changing. But if we look at the reality of debt loads in the United States and the debt service and all of the printing that's gone around the world, and the fact that the Fed has not done a good job of holding the reserve currency stable, not only internationally, but also in the US, you're seeing some of these shifts happen. You're seeing the BRICS countries looking at other alternatives. You're seeing central banks get rid of treasuries and stock up on gold. And so you're starting to see these shifts and changes happen. So if you're somebody who is smart and successful and powerful and connected, and you see that stakes are changing in the world, as President Biden did, as the people from the Business Roundtable do, you know something is going to shift. You don't know exactly when, but you want to make sure when it does that you come out on top. And so that really sets the stage for all of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And what I've been talking about in the book is that there is this change coming. And with the elite wanting to come out on top, in many ways, it's not so much that they're trying to intentionally keep you down. It's not that we have these people sitting around the table like Dr. Evil going, oh, how do we, corner the markets? But they are trying to preserve their power and their wealth. And if yours has to go away in order for that to happen, then that's just okay by them. And so we'll see that over and over again as we talk about the themes, as we talk about CBDC, as we talk about social credit, as we talk about Wall Street coming in and competing with individuals to buy housing. All these kinds of things that we talk about that it's making it harder to seize on that wealth creation opportunity and in America, the American dream. Those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to get at in a very non-conspiratorial way, student of history, lots and lots of sources backing it up, and hopefully having a very realistic conversation about what it is that we're living through.
And Carol, the idea of ownership is very critical here. And it's an issue you highlight in the book, and you point out the efforts to erode the individual's ownership of real assets by governments, by big tech, and by the elite power grabbers, as you call them. Ownership, a central theme in the book. And you write, quoting you to you, private property is the guardian of every other right. Property rights are fundamental to wealth creation. Studying economics and history, you can see that the advent of individual property rights brought prosperity and abundance to the world. Studying wealth creation at the individual level, you can see that the way that individuals create wealth is through ownership. Ownership is enhanced with a commitment to property rights and is threatened without such commitment. It is not a coincidence that Marxist, communist, and other derivative regimes of control don't have property rights and ownership as tenants other than for those in the inner circle or elite ranks. Once you as an individual own nothing, it is easy for the government or similar center of power to gain figurative ownership and control over you. I will say this many times to hit it home: if you own nothing, they own you. So explain that, Carol. Why is ownership so important to liberty and freedom?
I mean, it really is the cornerstone of what I've learned, 30 years in the financial markets, as I said, recovering investment banker. It is the one truth that the people who are wealthy became wealthy because they owned assets, and they owned assets that not only retained their value, but also had the opportunity to appreciate in value. So those two concepts are just absolutely intertwined. But as you said, it kind of extends past that. It goes to freedom. And let me use the idea of a house, for example, to explain both of those. in the United States, and I talk about this in the book and have all the charts and graphs that back it up, but the number one asset on household balance sheets across the United States is a house. Lots of reasons for that, but probably because, unlike a stock where you panic and you trade in and out of it, if you have kids in school and a job, you're not all of a sudden trading your house because, Zillow says one day that it's worth less. So you really have that duration. Duration is helpful in terms of creating, the capital appreciation opportunities and being able to cash in on that. So people have homes. And when you have this sort of movement, whether it's intentional or not, but Wall Street coming in and competing to buy homes, or people not being able to afford homes, or just selling this idea that, oh, come rent this house with all of these amenities and it's a much better lifestyle than maybe this smaller house that you could actually purchase yourself. Well, then you're giving up not only that biggest opportunity to create wealth on an average household balance sheet, but you're also giving up your sovereignty. So if you are living under somebody else's roof, it is much easier for them to tell you what to do. If the government wants to get rid of gas stoves or whatever insane idea they have, for the day, it's much easier for them to affect that through a group of corporate landlords than to say to me, hey, you've got to move that out of your house. And so to the extent that you want to control more people or to get them to give up sovereignty, that happens when people don't own homes. So it really is this 1-2 punch of wealth creation and freedom that are so much intertwined. And Michelle, when people hear the title of the book, the You Will Own Nothing, and think that it's just entirely about the World Economic Forum, it really wasn't. It was really about the fact that people were having a challenge with creating wealth. And I was looking at all of these disparate areas and going, what is the through line? And this prediction that they had for 2030, their top number one out of 8 predictions was you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, which became this crazy meme across social media. It really created a perfect through line. And if you think about just the phrasing of that, first of all, it's you'll own nothing, not will own nothing. Like the people who are projecting this and predicting this are not including themselves in that group, unlike the way Biden did with that New World Order statement. But the other idea is that you'll be happy. And as you mentioned, the quote that you said that from the book, the people throughout history who have not had ownership, who have not had property rights, who haven't been able to own these assets that are valuable, they have not been happy. They have not been wealthy. And in many cases, they have starved to death or, otherwise lost their lives. So this notion to get people to buy into this ease, like if you don't own things, you can have this carefree lifestyle, but you give up the wealth, you give up the freedom. Don't worry about that. You'll be happy. If you get someone to buy into that psychologically, it's much easier to affect this change than it is if people say, no, my happiness comes from my ownership, my ability to create wealth, my sovereignty, and my being able to chart my own path and not having somebody else with that quote unquote ownership over me.
But let's expand on that because it's not just about home ownership. As you point out in the book, we don't really, you take a step back and all of a sudden you realize, what do you own? People don't own cars. The majority of people, depending in big cities, are using Ubers. And even people that do own cars, as you point out, in some places you're leasing an operating system, right? Like there's subscription services for added revenue streams, like paying to heat your car seats in some cars as they're sold in parts of the world. You point out that, sure, I may own the phone, the hardware, but do I really have control over being able to use it or not if the operating system is owned by, Apple, for example, and they can decide to just cut me off there. So it extends well beyond just home ownership. And so I want you to expand on the idea of property, private property, and I take that, again, not just as homes, is the guardian of every other right.
It sure is. So, you can think about all the things that you own that are assets that have a significant amount of value. The homes, as we talked about, owning stocks or owning bonds or even owning alternative assets. Those are kind of the things that you think about. And there are other things that you use where it may be more convenient and it's not really an appreciable asset where you don't have the ownership. We know cars are depreciating assets, but at the same time, it is a trade-off for freedom because, if you have to depend on public transportation or Uber or whatnot, again, you are at the mercy of all of those, different entities. So you have to really think about that. So I think that's really the balance that we need people to think about. In the digital realm, when we get to technology, they really want to rent your entire life back to you as a subscription or a service. They want you to own nothing. But our digital rights really do hang in the balance. And I think that with AI coming out as a major disruptive force and coming fast and furiously, people are starting to think more about that. And in a way, we have these, so-called protections, at least here in the United States with the Constitution, around what it is that our rights are. But we don't have that when we operate in the digital sphere. And you have these massive tech companies who, have market caps that are bigger in some cases than the GDPs of certain countries, most of the countries in the world, that have more users than some of the biggest countries in the world, and have this crazy amount of power. And we just really take it for granted that we can have access to all of the things that they're providing. But at the end of the day, as you said, we've got these wonderful phones, but I don't own anything other than, glass and microchips and some plastic that I'm cut off from the operating system and I'm cut off from my email and all the things that are important to my workflow and to connecting with other people and being able to use my voice on X, formerly known as Twitter or whatnot, I really don't own anything. And I think that's where you can start to see both the wealth creation piece and the freedom piece kind of come together and see how they're so intertwined in this message about ownership. And really why it's important for us at this nascent time, in living in these sort of digital worlds, that we spend more time talking about digital rights and making sure that our rights are secured.
Right. And you point out how, we don't really have much choice when it comes to these digital rights. You get a user agreement and you can either accept or not accept. And if you don't accept, well, too bad. It's not like you can come back and say, well, clause 17B, I'm not that comfortable with, right? And if you don't accept, you're effectively cut out of a system which is integral to the functioning of society. I will definitely get back to the tech titans and their role, but I want to focus on what you said about the World Economic Forum and the title of the book, because as you mentioned, the title comes from the 8 predictions for the world in 2013, posted by the World Economic Forum on Twitter, now X, back in 2018, created from an article that they published in 2016. This isn't some conspiracy theory. Klaus Schwab says this all the time. You talk about Dr. Evil. I mean, some could say he looks like a central casting for a Bond villain, but nonetheless, you've got Klaus Schwab saying, as it is said in that list, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Whatever you want, you will rent. So why don't you give us some background here on Klaus Schwab? We know he formed the World Economic Forum in 1971, but for those that aren't familiar with it, or just know it as the organization that puts together Davos, where the rich and powerful gather in the winter of every year. Give us the background that we need to understand here and why we need to be concerned by their agenda.
Yes. So with Klaus Schwab, the one piece of credit I'll give him is he's one of the most persistent individuals I've ever seen. He's had these messed up messages and he has been trying to push them, repackage them, repurpose them, entrench them, like you said, since 1971, when it was originally called the European Management Forum, I believe. And, as things shifted in sort of the geopolitical landscape, what was sort of these business ideas ideas started to attract people from the political arena and the like. And somehow he just managed to sort of put himself in the middle of a lot of very powerful people. And so he was able to kind of keep putting out his message. One of the most interesting takeaways is that since that time in 1971, when he founded the European Management Forum, the WEF predecessor, he also put out a book. And this concept of the stakeholder kind of popped up at that point in time. And it really ties into everything that we're talking about here. He very clearly is trying to basically conflate the concept of a stakeholder with a shareholder. If you are a shareholder in something, in a company, for example, you've gotten that way because you've either put something at risk or, because you put something at risk. It could be your capital or it could be your time and your blood, sweat, and tears. But you have taken that risk and you are getting compensation for the risk. And that is why you are deriving benefit. His idea of a stakeholder is incredibly vague. It's anybody who wants to come along and basically free ride off of what a company or some other entity is doing and say, oh, well, I have an important stake in this. Well, you have taken no risk. You have done nothing. And he's been trying to conflate these issues, and we see them popping up over and over again as the EF has unfolded, and certain ideas which have been entrenched and populated by them, something like ESG, which we know has infected, all of corporate America, and we're just starting to get some pushback on. That goes back to this concept of, what is this quote unquote stakeholder that really doesn't have a stake in the asset, in the game, in the creation of something valuable, in taking that risk. And so I think that's probably the most important takeaway, is that you have these people who want to free ride on what other people are doing and, benefit off of their work and risk. And that has been inherent. But when you hear stakeholder, it sounds like they have a stake, but they really do not.
Give us a clearer picture of who these people are, as you say, because the World Economic Forum's tentacles reach far and wide. Give us a sense of who are the members of the World Economic Forum, why they're powerful, why we really should pay attention when Klaus Schwab says he has an agenda.
So the interesting thing is, if you look at their yearly event that they produce called Davos, or you go to their website and you look at some of the quote unquote thought leadership or articles, they are incredibly well connected with the who's who of world political leaders and companies. They have a list of partnerships, and you'll go through some of the biggest companies in the world, and you'll notice that they are named partners. You'll notice that there are lots of political leaders who have attended. And it's challenging to sort out who is just there because everybody else is there, and this is a way where I can make deals and get an ego boost and whatnot, and who's really carrying these bad ideas back and putting them into practice. One thing that I encourage everybody to look up is the video of Klaus Schwab at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, when he talks about this program they have, the Young Global Leaders. And this is where they identify political leaders and sort of bring them into the WEF system. And you have people like Canada's Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, who have been part of these leaders. And he cites them. And he's like, when you look around, and I go to these things, you have to penetrate the cabinets, and I look around and I know all these people, and they've been part of the WEF the Global Leader Program. And so when you have somebody like Klaus Schwab say, we penetrate the cabinets, I'm not sure what else that might mean other than we penetrate the cabinets. So while this is supposed to be a non-governmental organization, an NGO, it seems like they're very, very entrenched in government. And when you see their ideas like the ESGs popping up with all of the publicly traded companies, with the most powerful business leaders in the world, then you start to say, well, clearly there's some connection here. This didn't just happen organically where everybody thought of this at the same time. It's coming from somewhere. And again, very persistent. He's been in the middle of all of this. And if you look at the different entities that are around him, some of them are there with the best of intentions, I'm sure. But a lot of them are taking this nonsense and bringing them back to their countries and trying to, quote unquote, effect change in a way that is sort of non-governmental central planning, which is as bad as any other type of central planning when you have a handful of people who are trying to make decisions for the masses because they think they're better or smarter or because they have more power. It's done very opaquely, and then that gets pushed into the system. The other thing I will say is that the WEF is very entrenched with the United Nations. And one of the things in my book, as I was researching all of these different issues, the names that kept popping up again were WEF, United Nations, and some others. And at some point, it's like, well, okay, maybe this is a coincidence. But when it's over and over and over again, I don't believe that's coincidental any longer.
Right. And you have these UN goals, which seem to align quite nicely with the World Economic Forum goals. But before we get more into that, how are they exerting power, though? How are they? So they bring in these leaders and they're just influencing them through thought. How is this power actually exerted and manifests itself in intangible ways that lead back to this agenda?
That's really a good question. I don't think it's as formal as some people might like to think it is. I think that you get people in a room and you say, this is, what we're going to push, and here's how it's going to benefit us, and go back and go to it. Something like ESG, which I keep bringing up again because it's just been such a big push, was such a clear grab for power and wealth and influence that, I don't know that there was a playbook that was put out and you have to do this thing. But by bringing in all of these key players, people who are influencing the choices of shareholders, like, BlackRock and Larry Fink, who was a really big person in terms of bringing it, from a World Economic Forum discussion point into actually penetrating publicly traded companies. Now, of course, he's trying to distance himself from it, but that is the reality of how these things came to be. I think it's here's how we can benefit. Here's the money and the power lines, and everyone says that sounds great. I'm on board. This is the new thing, and they each go out and put it out in their own way. But, it is this connection between these organizations that foster these sort of centrally planned bad ideas and lay out the benefits for the people who then bring them back and, make us subject to all of them.
Right. Centrally planned bad ideas, which work to erode people's freedom under the guise that it is for what they deem to be the greater good. You mentioned ESG, and that links to the idea of climate change and that agenda. And a number 4 on the list, you'll eat much less meat, an occasional treat, not a staple for the good of the environment and our health. So that's number 4 on the list there. But let's focus on number 2 on the list of the World Economic Forum agenda for 2030, because that is equally as disturbing as you will own nothing and part of how this all fits in. And they say that the US will not be the world's leading superpower. A handful of countries will dominate. And you started to bring that up at the top of this interview. It's a topic that you break down in great detail in the book regarding the US losing its status as the superpower, as other empires have before it, like the Romans, like the Dutch, like the British. And you break that down in tremendous detail, the history of those empires, how they fell, and how the US has essentially abused the exorbitant privilege of having the global reserve currency. And you're saying that as the dollar life cycle comes to an end, as has been the fate of all reserve currencies, that the elites are positioning themselves for the Great Reset. So expand further on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we talked about at the top of the hour, that it is clear that there is some sort of life cycle going on, and certainly a lot of people can see it. What's been interesting in all of these cases when there has been a major shift is that it always comes internally. It's not that there's some other superpower that has challenged the one that was in place and said, I'm going to take this torch from you. It's always sort of implosion from the inside. And, we've seen the movie before. I attribute a lot of this to just human nature, but you get, this basic sort of push and pull between reality and debt loads, and countries cannot help themselves. The politicians get power by creating spending opportunities that they can go then and buy votes with. And so there's always sort of this carelessness, this moral hazard, if you will, related to the fact that they don't bear the consequences for their financial actions. So you get this insane debt. You start to get less investment in important things like defense. We are on a trajectory here in the US where we've got the interest on the debt, which is now surpassing to our spending yearly on defense. Neil Ferguson has his own law, which says that you can't, basically I'm paraphrasing, but you can't have a great country when you're spending more on debt service than you are on the defense of your country. So you get these sort of class wars that happen. And, it just all very much a historical rhyme, as they say. So we're seeing that happen. And I think some people misinterpret this. They misinterpret that, the dollar is going to go away and there's going to be no more dollar. We're not saying that that's the case. But what we're saying is a shift in the amount of trade that's done in dollars, or the shift in how much treasuries are being bought and by whom. All of these things impact how our government can borrow, our own ability to kind of live in a nation that for many years was not subject to massive inflation and have a certain standard of living. And I think that's the part that people aren't really appreciating, as the dollar has been weaponized, right, against Russia, that basically saying that we're going to seize your reserve currencies, and now they're looking to give those to Ukraine. Who wants to let the U.S. hold the reserve currency if they can just make those kinds of decisions? The same thing, goes when you have commodities like food and energy that are priced in dollars, and that's not held stable. If that becomes, much more expensive for a country because, it's more expensive, more dollars are required to purchase those. Well, all of a sudden that becomes a national security and an economic security issue for those countries. So you really can't blame them for wanting to look to alternatives. And, we've seen the shift. There's actually a great chart by Luke Groman, who I understand may be coming up on the program, in coming interviews, and one that he's put on a lot of our radars, that shows that over the last decade, the amount of central bank debt, the amount of U.S. government debt that we've incurred has more than doubled. Went from 16 trillion to now we're at 35 trillion. At the same period of time, central banks around the world were actually net sellers of treasuries. Their treasury holding went down by about $100 billion. So you no longer have these central banks who are loading up on treasuries. And the interesting dynamic is that they're not going into another currency per se, but they're going into gold as their supplement. So we are starting to see these shifts and changes. And as I said, I think just the perspective of people thinking that the whole thing needs to collapse versus, a meaningful shift will have meaningful changes on our way of life. And I think that I want people to be more focused on the latter. Not to say that the first couldn't happen over time, but we still have a massive economy in the US and a lot of really good things going for us. But does that mean that the next, 20 or 50 years is going to look like the last 20 or 50 years? Probably not.
Right. And, Carol, you discussed the weaponization of the dollar, which many say is a pivotal moment, right, by taking Russia off the SWIFT system. And I started off this segment by discussing how the SWIFT system is adopting CBDCs. So there's clearly a connection there. But you talk about the weaponization of the dollar, and you bring up a very interesting question of how much of this is potentially intentional or by design because of the mismanagement, if you will, of the Fed, which may be intentional or by design as well. And again, quoting you, is it possible that the weaponization of the dollar is intentional, perhaps to give support to the notion that the US doesn't want a dollar reserve currency? And is that all a cover because the government knows they have mismanaged the currency? Or is removing the US's standing in the world financially in and of itself part of setting up this new financial world order? Does it tie into some of the other changes going on in terms of global finance, power, and control? What we can project is that the US is in the twilight of its financial empire. The end of King Dollar and a US-led financial world order will lead to disorder before any stable new financial world order. This disorder will lead to chaos in all kinds of ways without the US willing or perhaps able to step in. And given that its currency no longer holds the same threat it used to, further competition for scarce resources will happen with nobody to play referee. This will likely lead to wars, famine, and a massive death toll around the world. The world will be turned upside down and new alliances will be formed. Kind of sends shivers down my spine, even though I've read this for the 5th time. But, do you think that this, could be by design, that this could be a way to, cover up for much of the mismanagement? You do point out with concrete facts to substantiate it, how the Fed is to blame for much of the troubles that we've seen since the formation of the Fed.
Yeah, it is all monetary and fiscal policy that has created these ills. As I said, this is not an outside force looking in that's, weakening us. We're doing it from the inside out. As to the question of whether it's intentional, I left it as this question and then sort of my projection, because in a way it doesn't matter. Some people might think it's fun to go through the intentional versus the not intentional. Who's stupid? Who's doing this on purpose? Is this cover? Is this just, human nature? From my perspective, Michelle, it doesn't make a difference. This is the reality that we're in. So whether they're trying to do it somewhat fully intentionally or not intentionally at all, I kind of don't care. What I care about is what's going to happen on the other side of it. And there are a lot of things that are at play. You mentioned that the chaos and potential for war, obviously we're seeing some of that percolate up, since the book has been written. One of the things that we know is that not every war brings about a new financial world order, but every new financial world order has been preceded by war. So that too can be a mechanism to try to change and reset things. And I read theories all the time about, what is going to happen and how all of this is going to get sorted out. That, many of it is sort of intentional things that governments can do. And my job is to not to figure out which of those are intentional. I don't find that fun. What I find important is to prepare people and make sure that they're aware that things are going to shift, and to be thinking about it, and so that they can take control over what they can control, because we're not going to be able to control whether somebody over in the World Economic Forum or the Fed or the government is pushing a new world order, but we can control what we're doing on a personal basis. And so I think that's the most important thing.
And we will get to that. We will get to how you help people prepare for battle or to push against this. But I want to focus on, and we touched on this a little bit before, but the other big power here, which is the tech titans, right? Because you've said in many ways that they are taking over the role of government. And you're right, while the government may be trying to keep you from ownership in a variety of ways, tech firms and applications are ensuring a lack of ownership with subscription models, making you a lifetime renter. This is what the World Economic Forum predictions meant when they talked about products being turned into services. And you talk about the digital gatekeepers and how we've, in effect, given so much of our rights and even government rights to these tech giants that government has very little control over our lives, certainly as compared to how they used to. So elaborate on the force of technology here in this Great Reset.
Yeah, so we talked about earlier the example of a smartphone, and that you really own, just this brick, but that, if you don't have the operating system, you don't have the email, then you have issues. When you think about the choice you have two companies that own 99.9% or something like that of the operating systems in the entire world. So, if you decide to opt out of one, you have one other choice. And if you're opted out of both of them, then you've been opted out of participating basically in modern society. And so that's why the whole concept of thinking about rights and pushing back on some of these things that seem super convenient is important. One of the things as I did the initial tour for my book is I told people that they should go out and they should buy a physical copy of my book, because these powerhouses have so much power that if you buy a digital version, how do we know that they're not going to shift and change the language over time? I don't know that. And, maybe there's something in an agreement that I signed along the way that allows them to do that. As a writer, I'm very concerned about AI, as somebody like yourself who is a television personality, a media personality, a presenter, just our own, being able to own our names, our likenesses, the things that are unique to us as human beings, as they try to use technology to consolidate that. So when we think about speech, when we think about, the rights to privacy, when we think about the rights to ownership, all of that is not really being protected well in the digital realm, which is becoming bigger and more powerful, frankly, than even the government is. I mean, if you think about, who has more of an impact on your day-to-day life, I would say for most people, it probably is these big tech companies. And there are a handful of them, and they have just incredible balance sheets that are rock solid, at least for some period of times, like we've never seen, multi-trillion dollar market caps. So it is something that I think is important to pay attention to, and for us to spend more time speaking up and trying to get our rights protected in the same way that they've been protected against the government, because the tech companies love it. It really benefits them for everybody to go along with it. And they're able to groom people. I mean, if you think about younger people, they are groomed to not have ownership of anything in the way that, somebody like myself had ownership, even of just, things like toys and music and whatnot growing up, that they don't know from that. So this idea that you don't have to own things really starts to become entrenched, and which is why spreading this message, I think, is so important to get younger people to make sure that they start thinking about physical, tangible ownership and what that means for wealth and freedom.
Right. And you point out the gamification that comes through these tech companies, as you just said, it's digital toys, it's digital music, you're owning less and less and giving away that power. By the way, for the record, I did get the physical book. I do like to actually read the hard copy. I find it, much easier to consume information the old-fashioned way. What can I say? So no one's going to be changing what you wrote in this copy here. But, this all comes into this idea of, tokenization and central bank digital currencies. And before we unpack central bank digital currencies, you mentioned BlackRock a few times in the book. You mentioned Larry Fink a few times, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. And the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, he has been very vocal about tokenization lately, saying that it's the next step for markets, is the tokenization of all financial assets, and that's already on the way. So how does tokenization, and that is a digital representation of an asset of a on a blockchain of sorts, further fuel this idea of you not having ownership and therefore less freedom and less control?
So I'll put the tokenization discussion in the framework of currency because I think that is sort of the best way to understand what it is we're talking about. So obviously, when you have a government and a Fed that has not been careful, that has not, they've been derelict in their duty, right, to keep our currency stable, to not, basically debase the currency. You have people who realize that and are looking for different ways around that. And I think that's been probably the primary driver and interest in cryptocurrency is let's get this decentralized away from these central planners, away from these people who, aren't bearing risks, who have no accountability, and, let people have more control. That's really what that's about. It's about preserving wealth. It's about having control and freedom. What the governments that are exploring CBDC, and as you said, pretty much every government in some way is exploring this. The Fed, although they claim they're not really doing anything right now, they have run pilot programs and they have done research and whatnot. So it's definitely been on the table. But I think what is happening is an intentional conflation between central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrency. And a central bank currency is the exact opposite in terms of purpose and focus and what it stands for than a cryptocurrency, where you have something like Bitcoin, which is entirely decentralized. The whole idea of a central bank digital currency is to give the Fed and, by extension, the government complete control. So if you imagine, any dollar that you have having a microchip in it, and it could be programmable, and not only programmable in terms of where you can spend it and if it expires, but that if you take it to the store, it could be tied into anything. Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle, you've eaten too many burgers this month. We think that cows are bad for the environment, so we're not going to let you spend here. And so that is central bank currency is the ultimate, it's in the name, it's centralized control. And just because it's digital and maybe tokenized or associated with a blockchain, doesn't give it the same principles as what is driving the movement behind Bitcoin. And I think that's the scary part in all of this, is that there's so much interest in what it is that decentralization can do, but because the masses are not well informed, and people know what a restaurant chain is and they know what a gold chain is, but they don't necessarily know what a blockchain is, and certainly not well enough to explain it and be intimately involved in owning tokenized assets, that it's hard for the average person to separate those. And when you think about some of the tricks that could be used to get people to buy in, no pun intended, to a centralized currency, whether it's a universal basic income, whether it's the promise to control inflation, because they won't tell anyone this, but if they have the ability to turn currency on and off, that's a really clear way for them to control demand. So there are definitely lots of different carrots that they can put out there. Even something as simple as, trade in one of your dollars and you'll get 10,000 digital dollars, and then all of a sudden people be like, oh, I'm going to be a digital dollar millionaire, not realizing that it's about the purchasing power, not about the headline amount. And we've seen that over and over again. That's part of the issue with the stimulus checks here in the United States, which caused inflation. So I think that's the concern that everybody needs to be thinking about when we hear about tokenization of assets and we hear about central bank currencies, we hear about cryptocurrencies. It's just this conflation about, who has the ownership, who has the freedom, who has the insight into that. And because it's new and it's, confusing and sort of uncharted territory for a lot of people, I fear that that's going to be taken advantage of in a very bad way.
Right. And Bitcoin is the complete antithesis of a central bank digital
Correct.
currency, in that it is decentralized and is a response to the failures of the financial system, as we saw after the 2008 financial crisis, hence the genesis of Bitcoin. But you bring up this point, which you bring up in the book again, that perhaps the central planners are using the confusion about what a digital currency is versus a cryptocurrency to try to capitalize. And in the book, I found this very interesting. You bring up the example of how in March of 2022, the Biden administration put out an executive order on ensuring responsible development of digital assets, which was really about a central bank digital currency. It started off talking about cryptocurrencies broadly, but then switched to cover policy and actions related to the United States central bank digital currencies, which, as we've just covered, is the exact opposite of Bitcoin and decentralized currencies. But let's expand more on this CBDC. And again, for our viewers, as a recap that are not familiar, this is a form of fiat issued by a central bank. It allows the government to program the currency, as you pointed out, to decide what transactions will or will not go through. You bring up the meat example. That's certainly one of my concerns. I'll be told I've had too much steak for the month, or I've taken too many flights and I've exceeded my carbon output, so my currency won't work for that purchase, or it will work, but with a big penalty, right? And under the guise of saving the planet. It's also, we've got the programmable aspect, which we touched on, and every transaction can be monitored. So there's zero privacy, zero anonymity, making it so much easier for the government or the powers that be to cancel people if they don't like what they're doing. And as you pointed out in the book, we saw very concrete examples of government overreach during COVID. And you point out the example of the truckers in Canada, how they were effectively taken off the financial system when they protested against mandatory vaccines, and how much it is so much easier to do that when you have a central bank digital currency and you can just click it. So a little more on why a CBDC is such a giant threat to our freedoms. Why it may sound fine and sure, download a digital wallet and we'll give you, digital dollars and it's just the same as you've been using Venmo or in your bank, because they may spin it. But why is it not like that? And why could it be such a slippery slope to a dystopian future?
Well, I think COVID is a good backdrop because, people saw a lot of behaviors there, but didn't maybe necessarily tie them into the concept of cancel culture or the financial implications there. So we saw people who were ridiculed because, you weren't wearing a mask. And so you got your social credits, you put out in a way where maybe people didn't want to do business with you, or you didn't take a vaccine, so you couldn't participate in the economy. You couldn't, go to restaurants, or in some cases, if you were, a policeman or a fireman, you might have lost your job. We saw them shut down businesses wholesale based not on data and science, but based on political clout and connections. We know that the small businesses bore the brunt of that I couldn't get my hair done at a small salon, but a dog could get their hair or fur, I guess it is, fixed and their nails done at a big box retailer down the street. So if you have a government who is willing to, push incentives and disincentives based on, what it is that they want to do to affect change, which we know they do that through taxes, they do that through policy, and now they did it through these crazy mandates in COVID. Imagine that they can do that now with the fruits of your labor. Because one of the things, Michelle, that people always forget is that money isn't sort of the promissory note or, just a number in your bank account. It's a proxy for your productivity. It's what you have earned. And they say this is a way for you to take that, what you have earned, and to give you something that you can go out and trade for goods and services. So you can't just, all these people who want to just add more money to the system. Well, if you don't have an increase in productivity, we know then that has just basically killed what it is that you have done in terms of productivity, and just put more dollars out there chasing the same amount of goods and services. And so we don't see people thinking through that enough. So imagine that now you have the fruits of your labor, and not only can the government destroy it through their fiscal policy and their monetary policy, but they actually can go into your bank account or at your point of sale when you're making a transaction, and they can weigh in with their policies and their incentives and their disincentives at that point in time. It takes away your privacy, it takes away your agency, it takes away your freedom. And potentially, if they wanted to, since they're the ones that have put it out, they can take it away. And you may say, well, we've got a constitution to protect that. Okay, well, where are you coming up with the money to go through the court system to fight this from, when it happens? So it really is a really scary future. I think it is the number one concern. If you want to do something that's just going to completely destroy the foundation of the United States of America, you bring in a central bank digital currency and it's just completely over. And I think the people who are interested in Bitcoin or in gold and silver and other physical metals as hedges, this is one of the biggest theses and concerns that people have worked to accumulate, some proxy for their productivity. They've built up wealth. And, when they have it in a monetary form, that they're worried that that can be co-opted entirely by the government. And it is just the absolute most frightening thing for freedom and wealth creation.
I couldn't agree with you more, Carol. That is certainly the issue that keeps me up at night, because so much of our freedom is tied to our ability to use money freely and have that as a real representation of our time and effort. And yes, we've seen our currency devalued and debased, but even so now we still have some control over it where we wouldn't if we have a central bank digital currency adopted. And again, this isn't some conspiracy, because this is actively happening. We have 134 countries exploring a CBDC. 98% of global GDP. Just 4 years ago, that was only 35 countries. This is according to the Atlantic Council, which is tracking this. This isn't some, theory. This was pioneered by the People's Bank of China, which should give us cause for concern in the first place. And they've linked it into, a social credit system potentially in the future, because they do have a very active social credit system there. But anything that the People's Bank of China is pioneering should make you, think twice in terms of losing freedom and control. But this is a trend that is growing. And it brings up the question of how likely are we to see one in the United States? I mean, so far we're being told, it can't happen without congressional approval. And if we do get one, it'll be wholesale and not retail. You laughed. Explain why those are not anything to make us feel better about the prospects here.
Well, I mean, you've met the government before, right? And so, yes, they have said many times, Jerome Powell has been, quoted on the record by saying that we require congressional approval to do this. However, I testified in front of a congressional committee. I followed Congress. You can sneak a lot of things in there without anybody knowing. I mean, they get these bills that are, thousands and thousands of pages where they have 20 minutes to make a vote, and stuff gets stuck in and snuck in different ways. So I think right now, the most important thing we can do is to just stay on top of it. Make sure that your representatives know that this is a giant no. We have had some states that have done a really good job in terms of pushing back. But part of the issue, and it goes back to sophistication, is, the Fed and anybody associated with Wall Street is much more sophisticated than anybody in the government. And one of the big concerns that I have, on top of all of the ones that we've talked about, is that they will try to put forth something that tries to create a barrier that actually, because of the way that it's written, opens up the door for a central bank digital currency. And I think we've seen some legislation in the past that caused some concern that hasn't moved forward, but enough where you're going, yeah, these people don't know what it is that they're talking about. So that's a big issue. But certainly if it benefits them to do so, which we know it does, and they get desperate, which we know that there's cause for desperation, I certainly think it is one of several things on the table that they could do. And it will be up to us as the American people to make this, it's important to educate people around you. And it's important that as these things pop up, that you use your voice. One thing that I've learned, and I am not a political activist, I hate politics, I'm a problem solver, but not enough people call their representatives and their senators in the United States. And the people who do actually, if they're even just a handful of people, it makes a difference because there's so few people who do. If you get 10 people who call in an afternoon, all of a sudden this is the biggest issue that they've heard about in weeks. So it is really important that the people who are on top of these things and see it coming down the pike keep a very close watch. And as soon as things are percolating, activate others to say absolutely not.
But Carol, can the US not have a CBDC if every other country or major country does? I mean, I started off this interview with saying how the SWIFT system is moving to adopt CBDCs. Can the US be competitive as a superpower, as the world leader, if it does not have a CBDC?
Absolutely, they can. I mean, they may not want to give up the power that it gives them internally, but in terms of their role in the world, that's been one of the biggest arguments around it, is that we have a very sophisticated, well-functioning system of exchanging currencies, and we don't need a CBDC for all of the quote-unquote reasons why other countries feel that they do. In fact, the Fed put out a system, I think it was, or at least started working on it, maybe a year ago, called Fed Now, which a lot of people freaked out about and said, oh no, this is CBDC. And it's like, no, that's just kind of the plumbing of the financial system, kind of like a wire transfer or ACH. And because we have these other great systems, we don't need to have a CBDC in order to affect change. So we're at the cutting edge of technology, thanks to our private sector, thanks to, the people we have, that are on top of things here and, being sort of in that leadership position. So if they do use that as the excuse, know that it's entirely an excuse.
Well, who is a big champion of CBDCs? The World Economic Forum. They are actually, shockingly enough, they're putting out handbooks, and along with the IMF, in order to help guide ministries of finance and central bankers in how best to introduce CBDCs, big champions of central bank digital currencies at the World Economic Forum. And you mentioned the World Economic Forum, you mentioned tech, you mentioned the elites, the wealthy ones of our society, and social credit scores and digital IDs. And it all comes together if you look at how it's all part of the UN's Agenda for 2030, where they say providing a legal identity for all and a digital public infrastructure is essential to achieve peace, inclusivity, and justice. So the United Nations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and partners of the Rockefeller Foundation have recently launched their 50 in 5 campaign to accelerate digital public infrastructure. And the aim is to facilitate a digital ID, digital payments, like a central bank digital currency, and data sharing rollouts in 50 countries in 5 years' time. So really creeping up on us. And this is all, again, linked to them having your data, them having a social credit system where they can grade you according to the data that they see, a digital ID that's linked to that in one easy way to access you, and then linked to a central bank digital currency. And, you look at the players here and you have to start to wonder how much of this is in fact coordinated, right?
Well, I mean, just look at the date, right? Why are all of these things 2030? Why is that the date for, the top 8 predictions were for 2030? It wasn't like it was in 2020. It was before that. So why was that the date? Why are the UN's, sustainable development goals around 2030? Why are all the climate goals around 2030? At some point, you just have to go, this doesn't seem like a coincidence anymore. I said that before with the same names popping up. Like, I'll give you a couple times, but when they're all running towards the same marker using similar language, of course it seems entirely coordinated. And, the part that kills me is that it's always sold with the best intentions. I shared a story in the book, Michelle, that you may remember, a vintage Twilight Zone episode where you had these fantastic aliens who came down to Earth, and the people of Earth were very like, what, why are the aliens here? And the aliens said, well, we saw that you have war and we saw you famine and we've got this great technology and we just want to help you out. We're just here to help the people of Earth out. And of course, they're entirely skeptical because nobody just, does things out of the goodness of their heart. But they put the alien under a lie detector test and he passes with flying colors. And the CIA group happens to get a copy of this manual or book that he's got with him. And they were able to decode the cover. And the cover is "To Serve Man." And they said, well, that foots. He said that they're here to help us. He passed the lie detector. They're here to serve man. So they're just out of the goodness of their hearts. They want to help us out. So, they use the technology. It looks great. It starts to work. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, maybe the people of Earth want to come visit us and see what it's like on our planet. And everyone's like, oh, that's great. And they go up in the spaceship. And one guy from the CIA is, boarding the spaceship. And it turns out his colleague has now cracked the code of the rest of the book and runs up and says, it's a cookbook. To Serve Man is a cookbook. And I just want to leave that with everybody, that when they try to sell this as it's for the good of people, the last time I saw something sold as the good of the people, it was To Serve Man, and that was a cookbook. So,
right.
You get lots of quote unquote good intentions out there.
Yeah, how to serve man as the dish, right?
Yes.
As dinner with your favorite sauce. No, I remember that anecdote from the book, and as I say, that is what's so great about the book, is that it really helps people understand these points in a very hard-hitting yet digestible, pun intended way.
Very well done.
An excellent read. So let's wrap up with, if we don't want to be served up as dinner, right, to the aliens or to the elites or World Economic Forum or powers that be, what can we do? I mean, this agenda is underway. Certainly, the dollar life cycle part, as you said, we can't really fight against the Fed. We can't really fight against the United Nations. We can call up our congressman, sure, and say we don't like CBDCs, but what can we really do as this financial World War F is approaching?
Okay, so if you've lived through the last 15 years, that that when they have to, use accommodative monetary policy, print money, and inflate away the debt, that tends to be very good for what? For hard assets. And so really every category of asset has benefited, over the last 15-year period. So this is very boring financial advice, but, now you get to see it through a different lens. You have to own things. They want you to own nothing. I want you to own everything. And that means a diversified portfolio. It means having some equities. It means having some precious metals. It means if you do own your own business, that's great. Do the things that you can to protect that. But really, own a home, do what you can so that you are participating in that inflation when it happens, and not just seeing your cash being, completely debased, but that you have the assets to move along with it. I think that's very important in terms of protection. And then, on the freedom side, I do think we need more people and more voices really pushing for a digital Bill of Rights, because as we've talked about over and over again, the freedoms that are being eroded here and all of these things that we're talking about are pretty staggering. And if we don't push back, if we don't get those protected, we're going to find ourselves in a world where the elites have everything and, most of the population has nothing. And it sounds very dystopian. It sounds very Ready Player One, right? Where everybody's living, with these goggles and these sort of dystopian realities, because the actual reality is so ugly. But that's, kind of the trajectory that we're on, that the people who are wealthy and well-connected have done very well. They're getting wealthier. They're owning more of the wealth. And for everybody else, that American dream, whether it's technically in America or somewhere around the world, is slipping away. And we cannot have people not have a purpose and not have that purpose be able to pay off for them. So people need to be able to work and that work, their productivity, that money that is exchanged as a proxy for their productivity has to be able to afford them to participate in the dream that they've worked hard for. So it's not sexy. It's not, hey, this is something that you haven't heard before. It's just a new lens and a new sense of urgency, and why you may have to be more austere in your spending and your lifestyle for some period of time, that delayed gratification, in order to own more things and set yourself up for the future.
Do you see Bitcoin as an asset that helps in this scenario? Granted, I mean, you mentioned gold, you mentioned hard assets. Some people would argue that Bitcoin is the digital version of gold, that Bitcoin in its purest form is supposed to be the decentralized answer to everything that we've discussed about government manipulation of currency, control, devaluing of your work and assets, debasement of your currency, that it is supposed to be a unit of measure as agreed to by consensus, by a network, by a group of people. I mean, there are issues with Bitcoin and government regulation still, but do you potentially see Bitcoin as another way to sort of protect yourself in this battle?
So I certainly think that Bitcoin is one of the alternative assets that people should consider, based on their own risk profiles, based on whatever else that it owns, filling that role as a potential hedge, a smaller part of it, the riskier part, that alternative asset piece of your portfolio. That being said, personally, I would say I am neutral on Bitcoin. I see the purpose. I understand the arguments. I also have some concerns. So I am neither a promoter or a detractor. I understand it. I accept it. I think that there are a lot of people who are really smart and well-informed on it, and people should listen to them and those arguments, and then decide if it fits your own personal risk profile and has a place in your portfolio.
All right. I will say that, I, for one, am a little concerned with the encroachment of traditional finance into the Bitcoin sphere, with the likes of the BlackRock and institutional finance launching the spot Bitcoin ETFs. It's a point I've raised before. I think it may be contradictory to the ethos of Bitcoin, although it may help, the number go up. But, in the long run, that is a concern that I've raised. Yes. And again, full disclosure to our viewers, I own Bitcoin and I own gold. So final thoughts here as we wrap up, Carol.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, just kind of putting a bow on all of this, people are struggling right now. And I am very empathetic to that. We have lived through this incredible time when we were able to do better than our parents and our grandparents. And for future generations, that is not shaping up to be the case. And that can be very demoralizing. But I think it's very important that people don't get sidetracked by the emotion and stay focused, that there still is a path forward. And it's not easy. I'm not poo-pooing the fact that right now it's hard to pay for food and it's hard to make your rent. But I would be doing everything if I was, 20 years younger, 30 years younger right now, similar to what I did when I was that age, to be as austere as possible. When I started out in my early 20s, I had a 400 square foot studio. I had a cardboard box as my bedside table, and I took every dollar that I could, first paid down my debt, and then you use that for investment and accumulating assets. And so I think the idea of ownership is got to be something that you view through a different lens and an important lens, because if you want to create wealth and you want to have personal sovereignty and freedom, that comes to you through owning things, through that ownership of assets that can retain their value and can increase in value. So they may want you to own nothing, but I want you to own as much as possible.
And then you will be happy. Own everything and be happy.
Yes.
As opposed to own nothing and be happy. But thank you so much. I do own the physical copy of this book, and I do again recommend it to our readers. We've touched on some of the issues, but really there's tremendous nuggets as you go in depth in the book. You Will Own Nothing. Carol Roth, really appreciate your time and your analysis today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and for doing such a great, thorough job and taking so much material and tying it together so seamlessly. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Carol. And before we wrap, I do want to say a special thanks to our sponsors, Swan Bitcoin. Just a reminder that Swan does offer an IRA product, which allows you to invest directly in Bitcoin with your IRA. There is a way to set it up so that you're basically buying Bitcoin on autopilot, and that allows you to take advantage of dollar cost averaging as you accumulate Bitcoin into your IRA. There's a link in the description with a special offer for Kitco viewers to help you facilitate that process. So check that out. And thank you again for checking out this video. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. For me, Michelle McQuarrie, and the rest of the Kitco team, we'll see you again soon.
On the Spot with Michelle McQuarrie is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Swan Bitcoin IRA. Your legacy, your way. Real Bitcoin, not proxies. Traditional and Roth IRAs. Fast, easy setup. Start now at swan.com/retire.